Today, we might think of radio as being a system where you listen to music or people talking, but when radio first started off, it was called wireless telegraphy because what was being sent through the air wasn't voice at all, but telegraph signals. We get more into the history of radio in our episode 5 discussion of Wells's The First Men on the Moon, where Marconi and Tesla come up. So we'll just give a very brief sketch here of some of the major developments on top of Morse. So Heinrich Hertz proved the existence of electromagnetic waves between 1886 and 1889, even though he saw no practical use for the discovery. Some agreed, others didn't, and over the next few years, people like Oliver Lodge, John Stone, Edward Brandley, Jagadish Chandra Bose, they all made important developments in the 1890s, and in 1895, Guglielmo Marconi took all these elements together to create a system where he was able to transmit over 2 miles. And on December 12th, 1901, he transmitted signals across the Atlantic Ocean from Signal Hill in Newfoundland to Poldhu in Cornwall. Wireless was used as a term for this phenomenon until 1906, and at an international conference in Berlin, they proposed the word radio to be used to describe what is wireless telegraphy, derived from the word radius from Latin, meaning ray. By 1909, wireless was commonplace aboard ships and gained a lot of publicity in a 1909 collision between two ships, the Italian ship Florida and the White Star Line Republic. A wireless distress signal was sent out, which was then QCD, not SOS, and only 4 people lost their lives in the disaster. 1,400 were rescued. So wireless really saved the day here. In 1910, wireless again made headlines when Dr. Crippen was arrested for the murder of his wife. The arrest and the seizure of the vehicles Crippen was trying to escape on was coordinated by wireless. So the police were basically able to get ahead of him in a more exciting fashion than was described by Ralph Pope, most likely.
That's really cool sounding, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The sinking of the Titanic in 1912 led to the Radio Act of 1912, which was the first U.S. legislation pertaining to radio. There were early experiments in voice broadcasting as early as 1905, and by 1919 and 1920, regular broadcasting stations were popping up, broadcasting music and voice programs, including coverage of the 1920 presidential election. Early radio listening was done through headphones, as loudspeaker technology wasn't quite there yet, and often had the appearance of these very electrical-looking devices, as they were often powered by an independent battery. By the late 1920s, they were starting to look more like furniture pieces and would more frequently be able to run on household power through the socket. The Radio Act of 1927 established the Federal Radio Commission, which was a precursor to the FCC. More complex signals in the form of FM for radio, and then video signals for television would emerge in the 1930s, with NBC launching in 1936 and commercial FM broadcast licensed in 1940. So as far as a chronology of technical advancements, that's probably where we'll stop. But I think it's important to really note that this new form of broadcasting over radio for audio and then television in the 1930s would create a whole new genre of media and a whole new culture of people who are able to engage with the format. When we were talking about these telegraph stories, a lot of the people using the telegraph were telegraph operators, people employed to do so. They weren't the average person. Whereas radio in the 1920s was very much a hobbyist thing that young children would get involved in the creation of and the activities, which we will see in a couple of our stories later tonight. But I think the first one we're going to be talking about with radio is relatively early in this timeline.
Yes, and this is another story from Scribner's magazine.
Yes, they get around.
Right, and this is, I would say, a much better story, personally. This is written by our friend Rudyard Kipling, who we covered in our second Ariel episode, and we discussed With the Night Mail and As Easy as ABC, and we both agreed that these were truly remarkable works of fiction.
Yeah.
Way, way ahead of their time, and definitely feeling in a lot of ways like a science fiction narrative told several decades ahead of what you would expect such a thing to emerge. We were reminded of writers like Heinlein and Frank Herbert, especially. Now, Rudyard Kipling himself is obviously a well-known figure for many, many stories and poems and novels, and also a controversial figure due to some of the people that he chose to hang out with and his stances about certain things that maybe were a little more nuanced than might at first appear, but were certainly worthy of criticism.
Right.
But I have to say that Kipling is probably one of the very best, for me anyway, writers that we've come up with on the podcast so far. At this point, I'm just really willing to sit here and listen to whatever he wants to talk about.
Yeah, for sure.
His stories are just so quirky, and they're so full of interesting detail. And we're going to talk about a story called Wireless. This was, as well as being published in Scribner's, 2 years later it was published in his short story collection, Traffics and Discoveries, published in 1904. So, our story takes place on a Saturday night in a chemist's shop by the sea. And that's basically a drugstore, if you wanted to know. But the story's narrator, who I think is a physician, perhaps, who's never named as well, so we'll try to avoid using the common appellation our narrator, or their narrator, but he's friends with old Mr. Cashel, who's the proprietor of the shop. This man is currently in bed with influenza, which is doing the rounds these days. And his assistant is a consumptive named Mr. Shaynor, and he's supposed to be running the shop. Now, the narrator has a casual interest in the new Marconi-derived wireless transmissions, which is something Cashel's young nephew is an enthusiast about. And he has a transceiver set up in the back of the shop, and he intends to make communication with Poole some miles away. He's got a really powerful set of batteries, and he's ready to test this new invention, which he will tell us all about in the story, in really cool detail and with a lot of verve. Now, our narrator fellow has gotten to know Mr. Shaynor as well, and he doesn't seem to really care about much besides drugs and commerce. And he's a dependable chap, and it's just too bad about the tuberculosis, right? So he's just grumbling about how cold it is and how anyone would be absolutely insane to go out in such a blustery night, when who should show up at the shop but his girlfriend, in quotes. And I say that because it really seems like he's probably paying her for his company. Like, I think that's pretty well established.
Yeah.
Kipling is definitely a lot more direct than Henry James about things. It's somewhat contemporaneous story, so again, it just sort of points to the fact that, like, you can't just say Henry James is of his time. That was just his writing style.
Right. And I guess there is a bit to say about English people versus French people, but also Proust is also, like, way more direct about that sort of thing, too.
Yeah.
And they do have similar styles, though I like Proust more.
Interesting, yeah. Well, she tells Mr. Shaynor to go out with her for a while, and Kipling says that Shaynor is like a drugged moth, and he obliges, leaving the protagonist, or whoever he is, to mind the shop. And this minding the shop basically consists of perusing various drugs and just trying them out.
Yeah, I mean, they had some pretty wild stuff on the shelves back in the day, I have to say.
Yeah, and he just, like, casually, just goes around opening drawers and sampling.
Yeah.
And so I've
had nights like that too, but jeez.
Yeah, it's just he's just so matter of fact about it. It's one of the funniest things I've read in a while. Like, he just okay, well, I guess I'm running the chemist shop now, so I can just poke around. And he makes this drink he uses cardamoms, ginger, alcohol, and chloric ether. Yeah. And he says it's really good stuff.
Yeah, I don't know if I believe that, but...
Yeah, I'm sure
Jari. Yeah,
Jari, yes, Jari would approve of this drink.
Yeah.
I've no doubt about it.
Yeah.
So he takes some of the drink back to the young Cashel, who's fiddling with his wires and coils and batteries. And they have an antenna on the roof. And there's a bit of a joke about this because somehow the antenna is connected to the plumbing. I don't know why they would do that, but
Yeah.
it is. So he says the water's electrified, and he talks about this previous experiment that was done in some hotel, and the ladies had been shocked while taking their baths. Cashel talks about the Hertzian waves manifesting in the coherer, which is a small tube with tiny magnetized filaments in it.
Radio signal detector, basically.
Yeah. And then Mr. Shaner shows up again, and he's coughing worse than ever, and basically coughing up arterial blood into his hanky. So that's not good. And he's given the ether alcohol mix, and also says it's really good stuff. And there's a bit of reflection on Shaynor, and
Right.
the elder Cashel said that he doesn't think that his assistant will last the year, which is too bad because he's been a pretty good and reliable one, especially compared with some of the predecessors.
Right.
Anyway, so the narrator asks, well, what do you take for your trouble? And Shaynor just says, oh, cigarettes and pastilles. So that's what I do. He has a sort of perfume bottle in the window with a poster. It's an advertising poster of this lady. And due to his various actions and constant looks at it, the narrator surmises that he's kind of using it as some kind of shrine. And old Mr. Cashel, who's in bed through the story and doesn't really play a part or show his face in any way, but he's told his assistant that he has to keep the shop open all night. So he just sort of dozes off in a chair while the narrator is just struggling to find something to read or do. Eventually, he doesn't find anything, so he just makes more drugs. And Shaynor, he sort of wakes up again, and he's writing letters, and the young guy is tinkering in the office and back. They can hear the crackle of sparks and electricity, and it's almost painful. It's knuckle stretching, is the way Kipling describes it. Now, Shaynor drinks some more, and he muzzily says, it's like the string of pearls around the neck of his lady friend. And then he points to the advertisement, and it's slightly weird. So then he seems to pass out in mid-thought. The teller of the tale goes back to the office and talks to the nephew of the proprietor. And Cashel talks about the Hertzian waves dispatched from the station, cohering the filings in the coherer tube, and how independent parallel wires will become electrically charged if just one is electrified. And Cashel is sure in 10 years a signal can be transmitted from anywhere, and the Hertzian waves will be picked up with a receiver similar to his.
He was pretty much right, too.
Yep. And he makes an analogy to steam. He says the battery is the steam power that produces the dots and dashes. The Hertzian waves, the hand that turns the valve. And the coherer with those magnetized filings is the valve itself, turned by the hand. And Cashel's really excited, and he wants to live to see further future developments. It's a true science fictional pioneer thought expressed here.
Yeah.
It's so awesome. It's so I don't know, Kipling's he's got it. He's got what, even though he's not a science fiction writer, he's got the essence of what it really is. And that's probably why he is, in fact, somewhat praised by some of the early writers in the field in the 20th century. So the two commiserate a bit about Shaynor, and apparently the girl's name is Fanny Brand, and Cashel, in the typical sort of blunt Kipling way, he calls her a big fat lump of a girl. And
I mean, even her name is rather coarse.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely a stage name of some sort. Yeah. So Cashel observes that the transmission from Poole is late, and he presses his key, and it results in a flurry of sparks and a crackling noise. And he calls it grand, and goes back to the front, hangs out with Shaynor some more. The poor guy looks half dead. And then a change abruptly seems to come over him, and he stands and starts reciting broken lines of poetry while gazing at the advertisement. And the narrator seems to recognize the poem. It's Keats' The Eve of St. Agnes, but it's slightly modified. And Shaner appears to be going through all the rigors and, like, sort of torment of composing a poem. He's pacing around. His face is adopting all sorts of grotesque expressions. He's mumbling nonsense. He's waving his hands in the air. And Kipling, or whoever is telling this tale, is very surprised because he doesn't think that Shaner's ever read Keats. No interest in poetry whatsoever. And he sits down and starts writing feverishly on notepaper. And he appears to compose several verses and occasionally lapsing into prose and talking about the young lady and how beautiful she is and so on. And most of the time it resembles Keats' poem, but there are some modifications. Maybe Kipling is saying that he's a better poet than Keats. I don't know.
Yeah.
I wouldn't put it past him somehow. But the items in the room seem to give him clues as to what to write. And the narrator is very interested in what's going on, so he shuts the door to the inner office and sets to observing Shaner at his weird new composition. And Cashel seems confused as well, as he's also getting a transmission. But it's not from his expected contact in Poole at all. And Kipling says that Cashel is talking as if he's in the presence of spirits, which is oddly appropriate and really funny because of what's happening in the outer shop itself. Right. Kipling says, oh, well, something's coming through here too. And he tells Cashel to shut the door and leave him alone for a while. And the other guy's, he's a bit offended. And he suddenly starts calling him sir and all this stuff. And he's like, oh, I thought you wanted to see this wonderful demonstration. And Kipling seems, I don't know, he seems like he's probably pretty high on ether himself. Because he starts thinking that if Shaner has read Keats, it's probably the drug talking, it's probably the ether itself. But if he hasn't read Keats, then he makes some weird connection between the TB, like the bacillus of TB. So he makes this link between the tuberculosis and the Hertzian waves, and he thinks that there's some kind of mental induction going on. Now, Shaner is walking around and looking to the drug drawers and various almanacs that he has stored in his office desk. Shaner's composition seems to be going well now, and he sort of gains confidence as he looks at the various things in the shop. And everything in his environment, that is the true environment that Shaner is in, that is the rain outside and the wind and the cold, it seems to inspire him, and he starts writing about it, and he writes lines of poetry, which I'm not quoting. But finally, in an excess of trembling, he knocks over the chair with a crash and stretches, announcing that he has had a nice doze. So he gets interrogated by Kipling, and turns out he's never read Keats, indeed, and has barely heard of him. When he's asked if Keats is a popular writer, Kipling just says, oh, middling.
Yeah, I kind of wonder what his thoughts were on Keats.
I don't know. I find it amusing to think that
oh, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I love all those author feuds and then talking
I think he's really having fun with this ending.
Yeah.
I'll talk about this in a minute, but he thought maybe Shaner had heard of him because Keats was also a druggist. And he repeated to Shaner a line that Keats wrote about syrups and tinctures, and Shaner's all, oh, anybody could see he was a druggist because of that line, you see?
Right.
He sees it as nothing more than a tribute to the profession. So he's obviously he doesn't have a great ear for poetry in general. So we go back to Cashel in the office, and he's been receiving signals from two ships, it turns out. They're way off in the south of England, near the Isle of Wight and Portsmouth. And they've been trying to talk to each other, and it's not been working out very well. Maybe because their receivers aren't set right to the right frequency, maybe. Or they're malfunctioning. We're not really sure. But they're only catching little snatches of the dots and dashes. And Cashel is able to hear everything. And he's hearing lots of, your communications don't make any sense. Stop. Something's wrong and all this. And he says it's a bit pathetic. And he says it reminds him of spiritualist seances.
Yeah.
And Shaner says, oh, all those mediums are fake and just doing it for money anyway. Kipling says he's going to bed.
Yeah.
And that's the end of the story.
Yeah.
And I don't know. This was marvelous. I love this story.
Yeah, I like this one a lot too.
At first when I read it, I was kind of disappointed in the ending because I thought that it didn't really come together. Didn't really see why why there was any link between the radio and the telepathy or whatever
Yeah.
Shaynar was experiencing. But after a bit, I realized, oh, he's just trying to be kind of funny with the ending. Like, he's just kind of trying to be like, it's a bit of a joke.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's a nice one, and it's a good one. And it's pretty funny because apparently one of the criticisms of this story is that there's too much unnecessary detail. But I feel like that kind of made the story.
No, I like this one a lot. I mean, and the detail is kind of what makes it. It's all the quirky stuff he puts in here. I mean, like, what the hell is this drugstore? You know, anyway, like, all the weird stuff that goes on here, it's just such a odd sketch. And
Yeah.
I think without those details, it wouldn't be what it is. It wouldn't be nearly as good.
No, I totally agree. I think that is what makes it. Like, I think that a contrast between this and the story that we're about to cover, which is the Campfire Girls of Roselawn, for those who might want to listen to that, is that story has a lot of extra words that amount to nothing.
Right.
They're just obviously there to pad out the word count itself.
Yeah.
Whereas this has really interesting background and just little quirks of detail that, while they may not necessarily add much to the main plot of the story, add a lot to your enjoyment of reading it, and add a lot to the style, and add a lot to the passion of the characters. Like, the way Cashel is so enthusiastic about radio, the wireless, which is radio, of course, is, I mean, it totally reminds me of the way like those old science fiction stories that were written in the 20s and a little bit into the 30s, whereas, like, marvel at this wonderful piece of tech wizardry, right?
Right.
But this was something that was new and real at the time, and
very new.
we can see from that, and we can see from that, and, like, even in reflected in With the Night Mail as well, just how interested in this stuff the writer of these stories actually was, and the passion for it, and the real care for things like engineering, and, like, interest in how it was all done, even though his stock and trade is the writing of words, really comes through loud and clear. And unlike some of those stories published in maybe the early 20s pulps, and, like, maybe some of the stuff that we're going to do next time, this is actually really good. Like, this is really well written. It's fun, but it's also, like, a little bit naughty, like, in just some of the suggestions and stuff like that. And it's not too indirect about it, like James was. You know, it's very plainly spoken and very bold. And I really admire the way that he is able to tell a story. And this was definitely the case with The Night Mail and ABC as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I reread this one, and I reread those when we read those ones.
Yeah.
So far, I generally have been avoiding doing second reading for things in Chrononauts because there just doesn't seem to be the time. And
right.
I just don't.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes I just don't want to.
The James was actually the first time I did a second read. Well, I guess aside from the translations.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So, and I just think, like, his stories definitely warrant a little bit of that, not because they're difficult, but again, it's because of that detail, and because the more you read about it, the more you appreciate it. Like, the first time I read With the Night Mail, I was sort of like, wow, that's cool. Like, I like that. That was really interesting. But he really threw a lot of stuff at you.
Yeah.
So it's hard to remember sometimes, like, oh, you know, what really happened, because there was just so much interesting background to get lost in. Then I'm reading as a second time, I was like, oh, it all sort of comes together. And it all, like, you know what to expect in that background, and you know what the details for.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it just works. It just works so well.
Do you know if there's a good audiobook of this one?
I don't.
Yeah, I'll have to take a look.
I didn't actually look. I haven't been looking for audiobooks lately. I've been getting more into the reading aspect, I guess. The last time I used one was for 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Okay.
So this, I believe there is a reading, though. I believe I did come across one, and I didn't end up listening to it. Just found it on YouTube, so I don't know how good it is.
Right.
Could be LibriVox as well, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I'm hoping it would be good. The person that did With the Night Mail, I think we did mention it in that episode as well, come to think of it. He did a really good job of those stories, especially ABC. So somebody like that reading Kipling would be ace. This was just such fun. I called that this was going to be... It's so funny because I said as I was reading it the first time, oh, this is probably going to be the best fiction. And then I finished it and I thought, okay, it didn't really come together in the end, but I still really liked it. But then the more I thought about it, the more I'm like, yeah, it doesn't matter. He's just trying to be, like, amusing with it, and just sort of, like, it doesn't have to tie together. It's just, oh, here's Cashel being a little bit disillusioned by the radio and being, it reminds me of a goddamn seance. Like, just
Right.
all these people, like,
Yeah.
talking fragments and bits of nonsense at one another.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, Kipling or whoever is hanging out in the front and experiencing this weird psychic phenomenon. And he's like, oh, I don't know what that was all about. Somehow this, like, crazy, sick, drugged up guy is channeling Keats. I don't know. I got a real kick out of it, man. It was just so... it was so on point with that humor element. And yeah, there's I like you mentioned, the weirdness of it and the random drug taking.
Right.
And,
yeah, no, this was great. Definitely recommend this one.
Right. Absolutely. So we talked about the advent of radio communications by voice. And now we're going to discuss, for the first time, we're going to take a look into the world of 1920s juvenilia. Whether we know it or not, probably a lot of us as kids read assembly line books. We may not have realized that that's what they were at the time. And many of them perhaps were begun by single authors. That is, many of the series may have been begun by single authors. An example might be, I believe, Caroline Keene, who wrote the Nancy Drew novels. Another would be the two writers of the Hardy Boys books, whose names I cannot recall. But essentially they became house names.
Yeah. The Hardy Boys I read a whole bunch of when I was a kid.
Yes, yes. There were also books about these kids called The Three Investigators that were published under the byline of Alfred Hitchcock, but I don't think Hitchcock really had anything to do with it. This series, The Radio Girls, from 1922 to 1924, I believe, is attributed to somebody named Margaret Penrose, who may or may not have been a pen name for Lillian Garris, but was mostly a house name for the Stratemeyer Syndicate, which published dozens and dozens of juvenile novels in the 20s and 30s, I believe.
Yeah, they were pretty much the kings of assembly line juvenile stuff at the time.
Yeah. So there is a website right now called stratemeyer.org where you can actually look up some of their stuff, but it doesn't actually say much about this. But it's kind of interesting that it seems to be a phenomenon that sort of lived on, I guess.
Yeah.
So Edward Stratemeyer was apparently a writer himself and founded this organization, which sounds like the name of a crime syndicate. Like, I don't know. It's weird. So we don't actually know who wrote this. Margaret Penrose also was attributed as the author of the Motor Girls series, which was sort of piggybacking off of what was then the popular Motor Boys series.
Right, right.
At some point, the series of the Radio Girls, which consisted of 4 novels, was sold off. It was sold off in 1930 and became the Campfire Girls. I don't know why. Maybe as it went on, it had less and less to do with radio and more with campfires, and there were other books. I don't know.
Well, I think the Campfire Girls was an existing series that had like dozens of entries, and again, it was more assembly line stuff. So, okay, you have 4 books ready to go. Let's just change the titles and pretend that it's the same thing. It's another way to recycle the same content and milk more money out of what might have then been on the decline. Because in the early 1920s, there's a lot, and I mean a lot, of juvenile radio novels. Radio was a easy hobby for kids to get into, and it was definitely marketed towards kids from an engineering hobbyist perspective. And of course, if you have books to go along with it, that's even more money you can get out of the phenomenon. So there's a lot of these type of novels out there.
Yeah, it's really interesting too because like of the early history of radio and
Right.
how new it was, but also like weird things that happened during the First World War. Like there was a point there in 1917 where the United States tried to ban radio, like all commercial radio, amateur radio, any like transmissions or listening.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it didn't last for more than 2 years because obviously there was a lot of doubt as to whether the government of the country had any real jurisdiction to do that kind of thing, which kind of is good, makes sense. But during this time and a couple years later, yeah, it was definitely an amateur hobby, and there were commercial radio stations starting to spring up that played live broadcasts of music and comedy and sold airtime to advertisers of various kinds. And as we will hear throughout this book, there were also lectures, much to the chagrin of children all over the country.
Yeah.
So this is this is a really different kind of book for us. This was kind of a weird experience for me, but it went by really fast. I really raced through this like it wasn't painful in any way. Usually books that are painful make me put them down for long periods of time. This was easy to just sort of I would wake up in the morning and I would read like 4 chapters in like 10 minutes. Like this was probably the simplest thing that we've read for the podcast so far.
Yeah, we've definitely read stuff for the podcast that's been intended for a more younger juvenile audience, but I think this is maybe the first thing that's unambiguously a children's novel.
Yeah, Steam Man of the Prairies probably too, but that book was boring. Like that was just kind of, I don't know, that like I'm not saying this is some literary masterpiece, but compared with Steam Man of the Prairies, it might still come up on top.
Right.
So our protagonists for this book are some girls. They live in Roselawn, which is a fancy neighborhood in New Malford, wherever that is.
I had to look this up. So
I think it's somewhere in New York.
It's actually in New Jersey.
Okay.
The real town is New Milford with an I, which was incorporated in real life in 1922. So pretty much right when this was written.
I see. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, their names are Amy and Jessie, and they live in a nice community full of roses. And Jessie is passionate and intellectual, and Amy is worldly and sarcastic. And Jessie is really interested in this new thing, personal radio. And she thinks she and Amy should go and buy some wire to create antennae so they can build a radio set. And Jessie really wants one, so the chums go to town. And they go to this kind of not that great neighborhood, and they hear this girl calling for help. And in Dogtown, which is...
Yeah, this part is like, there's this one
we'll
line
get to that.
where she says something like, it would have not been an unsightly spot if the marks of the habitation of the poor and careless folk had been wiped away. And it's like, Jesus, Margaret, what the fuck?
Yeah, and it's so weird, too, because...
Comes out of nowhere.
It comes out of nowhere, but she tries to, like, engender a lot of sympathy, and there's a lot of, like, pro-women sort of, like, posturing going on in this book, where it's like, well, women should be able to climb up trees and telephone poles and string wires just like men can, and women can wear overalls and get dirty, and, like, that's perfectly fine.
Right.
But at the same time, like, it is very sort of snippy, and it's
class
really attitudes, and just sort of, So, in Dogtown, which is the bad part of town, where exploitation is rampant, the chums discover a girl being kidnapped, apparently, and thrown into this car against her will. And they discuss what they should do, and they wonder about where the girl might have come from, if she might be an orphan. They've never seen one of those creatures before. So then they meet Nell, the daughter of the local reverend, who actually has a radio set. And Jessie is a little bit jealous.
Yeah, this is another area where I'd marked down a very weird phrase where she wrote, but Nell was something between a daughter and a wife to the hardworking Dr. Stanley. And, like, geez, I get what you're trying to say, but that's a hell of a way of phrasing it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the mother died, and now, like, Nell sort of looks after the house, and the suggestion is, like, the reverend's kind of too high and up in the clouds to really take care of things, so she kind of does it all for him.
Right.
So it's supposed to be, like, empowering, but it's not. Like, it sort of comes off really strange.
Yeah.
So then they go and listen to their radio, and they have an amplifier, so they don't even need to listen to it on headphones. And Jessie's brought a bunch of radio books home, and the parents study it. Her parents are good, caring people, and they're always around to help out Jessie when she needs it. So Jessie's determined that they're going to put up the aerials, and they're going to string them up high on the house. And the parents say that's fine. And they even talk about getting their own radio for the drawing room. But Jessie's like, well, this one's going to sit in my room, which is a really big, opulent room, by the way. It's a room that any 12 or whatever year old girl would be envious of, like, at any point. This is an awesome, awesome room this girl has. She's very, very privileged. This is exciting work for the girls. And indeed, they put on the farmer's overalls and they get down and dirty. But then, some boys show up. And they're Amy and Jessie's darlings. Well, one is Amy's brother, actually, Darrington. And he's been away. They've both been away, actually, at college. And I guess Jessie has a thing for him, I think. And the boys and girls razz each other for a while. And all of a sudden, this mysterious girl in tattered clothes just sort of shows up, like, out of nowhere. And she says her name is Henrietta, and she's looking for her cousin, Bertha, who seems to have gone missing. And what do you know? They're orphans, so they've just seen their first orphan. And Bertha went to work for somebody and apparently was treated very badly by these people and ran away. And Henrietta lives with this nice family, but they have like 6 kids, and the father is an alcoholic, so he's like not really in good shape. So again, the woman pretty much has to look after everything, but I think she has it much harder than Nell does, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah.
And Jessie is very kind to her, and she says they'll keep an eye out, but nobody thinks to ask or tell what Bertha looks like, or anything about her, really. So
very strange. I mean, the characters are very slow at piecing the mystery together, even though there's lots of very...
I mean, they're kids, so whatever. Like, it's, I guess it's just implied that, like, they're pretty cool, but they're not necessarily the fastest. But they come up with things eventually. Like, Jessie randomly makes the connection with the mysterious kidnapped girl, but it's too late to say anything because she's the only one that thinks about it. So, meanwhile, the radio is set up in Jessie's room, and they listen to a concert broadcast. And the station, which is at 360, which seems like low. I don't know. I guess that's normal for early AM band transmissions.
Yeah, I don't know what the bands were back then, because this would have been before the radioactive 27, which would have, I think, regulated use of that. So I don't know if people were broadcasting a lower band.
I guess so. Nowadays, I think that would be considered like long wave or something.
Yeah.
It's not considered part of the AM band, I don't think. But I could be wrong about that. I was really into radio when I was about 10.
Yeah, I don't really know too much about the amateur thing, and there's certainly a lot of it out there, and a huge wealth of resources.
Yeah, but most of it uses much higher...
Yeah, right.
Like, higher frequency rate. AM is... I should have written down some of these figures, but it's like... It's within a certain... between, like, 500 and 1,500.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So, anyway, then we get a lecture, which they hate, so they throw down the phones in disgust. But Jessie and Amy do spend a long time playing with the radio, and the house becomes really popular in the neighborhood.
Yeah, I think there's one point here where there's a line where they say, and the radio stuff certainly comes through the air. Or do the Hertzian waves come through the ground, as some say? Which I thought might have been a reference to Tesla's theories, because that's how he thought the whole thing worked.
Huh, interesting.
I'm not entirely sure. It's kind of a throwaway line.
Yeah, there's a lot of throwaway things in this.
Yeah.
It's hard to say where the author was coming from sometimes.
Right. Yeah.
It's kind of like, I kind of wanted to be like, hey, Lillian, or whoever you are, like, tell us what you really think about stuff. Yeah. But she's writing the Radio Girls series, so she can't. So, I don't know. Oh, yeah, so there's this woman that shows up, and her name's Mrs. Grimsby, and she's the local scaremonger. And she says, oh, you better be careful. She's talking to Jessie's mom, and she's like, you better be careful. These things are prone to attracting lightning. And Jessie's like, oh, don't worry about it. There's a lightning switch. Everything will be fine. Now, I couldn't quite absolutely figure out what a lightning switch is, but I guess it's a common thing to protect your antenna from, like, I guess it's a grounding thing?
Yeah, I would assume it's a ground. I didn't really look that one
Yeah.
up, but yeah.
There was something about it that I was looking at with antique radios, and like, yeah, it has to do with the antenna. Maybe somebody can enlighten us. I didn't get around to looking up this. I was away during the weekend, and my last-minute lookups didn't quite pan out.
Yeah.
So I did want to look into the lightning switch a little bit, because it was kind of interesting, but the girls, on a whim, decide to go on a canoe trip to the end of the lake that borders their street, which is Bonwheat Boulevard. And they're going near the old Carter place, the scary, ruined house where there are supposed to be wild strawberries and ghosts. And they pass the brook that empties in the lake, and that's where Dogtown is. And Amy comments on how unsightly it is. And Jessie, though, being the more kind-hearted and sweet-natured of the two, thinks of Henrietta. And they reach the shore. It suddenly gets cloudy and a storm starts, and they run for the spooky house. And they're inside and sheltering. But who should they see outside but Henrietta getting soaked to the skin? And they coax her into the house, and they feed her all their lunch. And they talk about the people that kidnapped the girl early on, and they are described as a ugly fat woman and a waspish thin one. And they push the poor girl into this big French car early on in the book. And they pretty much confirm, I guess they're talking to Henrietta about all kinds of stuff at this point.
Yeah.
It all kind of comes out, and they find out that that's Bertha. But before they can really get too many details, they hear something thrashing around upstairs. It's the ghost!
The Hant.
No, it's not. It turns out it's two snakes that are fighting with each other. Well, a whole bunch of snakes, maybe. And I guess they hang out up there and make a lot of noise, and so people think the place is haunted. Henrietta is sort of violent and knows how to take care of business, so she smashes their heads with a big stick. And the others talk about how brave she is. And the funny thing about this, all throughout the book, although they're sort of like sympathetic to Henrietta, they always talk about her like she's not there.
Yeah.
It's really insulting, actually. Like, and Henrietta don't talk so good,
Right.
but she's really smart.
Certainly efficient at killing snakes and just getting right down to business.
Yeah. I'd said that we should be not only sympathetic to her, but sort of proud of her achievements. And yet, she's treated very, I don't know, like a non-person almost. Like,
Yeah.
she's just talked around all the time, and we'll see what happens later. She kind of gets really, like, stupid for no reason. Bertha was going to see Henrietta, and she had written her a letter to that effect, and she never showed up. And she never really explained what was the deal with this person that she was staying with and how bad she was and what she was doing exactly. And eventually that woman did show up looking for Bertha, and she was, like, obviously really angry and aggressive, and Henrietta didn't really have a good feeling about it. So they're back home, obviously, after their little adventure, and Jessie's dad happens to be a lawyer, Mr. Norwood, and he's working on a case at this moment that's causing him a lot of stress. So when Jessie tries to tell him about Bertha, he really isn't really interested. He doesn't, like, respond. He's just kind of humoring her. Meanwhile, the church is planning this bazaar that doesn't really play into the story. It's just kind of like something to show how good Jessie is at coming up with ideas. She wants to use the radio as a kind of lure for the...
They're holding a contest for what girl under 18 can come up with the best unorthodox way to raise money. And it's like, what?
Yeah, and
it's so convoluted and...
Well, it's encouraging innovation.
Yeah, right.
You know, I dig the contest, but the funny thing is, like, her rival in the contest is this girl called Bella, who's, like, sort of portrayed as this kind of a bully, but not really. Like,
more than like the mean girl type. Yeah.
Yeah, but she doesn't really do anything that aggressive in the book. All she does was flirt with this guy, Darrington, I think it is, or maybe it's the other guy who's like not interested in her at all. And the author says over and over again that Bella's problem is that she thinks that she's all grown up.
Yeah.
And like we get told this like maybe a dozen times, and it's literally the only problem with this girl. Like I don't know, it's just I didn't I didn't get it. So yeah, they have the bazaar, and there's a radio tent set up, and it's a big success. And there's an old guy talking about the telegraph, And he goes through the history of it, rather like we've probably done. And then they go into the telephone and talk about how we have automobiles and flying machines now. And radio beats the world, says someone else. And Jesse's encouraging to people that want to set up their own radio sets. And she says it doesn't cost very much, maybe $10. So the thing about Bella that I was going to mention, by the way, we never find out what her idea is. We just know that she lost.
Yeah.
So, like, I don't really know. It's so weird. Like, it's, like, set up as this rivalry, and, like, the author doesn't even choose to tell us, like, what it is that it's just like, oh, Bella's so sure she's going to win, and then she doesn't.
Yeah.
And so she's jealous of Jesse throughout. But we never even learned what it is that she's come up with. The case that Norwood's working on, I don't know, it's some really convoluted thing about a law case, and it's like
an inheritance fight, I think.
Yeah, this Mr. Ellison had died suddenly, and he had, like, been staying at this woman's house named Martha Poole, and she and some person named Bothwell are cousins, and there's a girl who overheard the statement, and now they can't find her, and put two and two together, and that might just be Bertha, who
Right.
Jesse is looking for. And she brings it up to her dad, and he's kind of like, oh, that's interesting. Meanwhile, these Stanley boys are really taken by the radio idea, so Jesse decides to help with supplies. And they go to Dogtown, and they see a bunch of kids chasing this spotted snake person, who, of course, turns out to be Henrietta, and it's just a game they're all playing. And Henrietta is all composed as she's taken back to the Norwoods, and they talk about getting her some new clothes. And she confirms that her cousin is, in fact, Bertha Blair. And Mr. Norwood has photos of the two women, and the fat one and the thin one, and it turns out it's the ones that Jesse saw. So now these two college boys that they know, one of them's Amy's brother, and the other one's name is Birdington or something like that. They have a friend from college, Mark, and he's this rich person whose family owns the electric company or something.
Yeah.
And they go hang out at the radio station.
Yeah. The cool millionaire guy who just, like, shows
Yeah.
up with his fancy car and, like, yeah.
Yeah, and he climbs trees and stuff, too.
Yeah.
He's pretty good. And he also runs the radio station, so they all go and hang out there. And they meet this person named Blair, who's the program director. And that night, they tune in on the radio. But suddenly, through the ether, they hear a girl repeatedly crying out for help. Everything is pointing in one very solid direction here, folks. So the Norwood chauffeur, this person named Chapman, tells them about a farm out by this place called Parkville. And Amy and Jesse are convinced that Poole and Bothwell ladies are there, and that they have some kind of broadcasting station. Why they should do this, I don't really know. But they must be secretly broadcasting some kind of information, is what Jesse thinks. And given that, I think it was Henrietta perhaps said something about gambling, I don't know.
Yeah.
I can't remember where they learned that they were gamblers, but they learned it
I think that was
somehow.
just the assumption that they made. They had to be in some shady business, so the thing that comes to mind is, like, horse racing gambling.
Yeah, but I thought there was something more concrete than, oh, we assumed that that's what they're involved in. I guess I didn't write it down, which is kind of funny, because I just wrote down a lot and blazed through it. But
Yeah, no, I wrote down that it was perhaps, so I think they might have been assuming that it was just in conjunction with, like, the racetrack gambling. Maybe it's near
Yeah.
the racetrack or something like that.
Yeah, it is near the racetrack.
Yeah.
You're right, yeah. So they drive over to the farm, and it looks like the right place, but they don't see any broadcasting aerials. But they go to the real estate office, and the guy quickly gives up the name Martha Poole as now owning the Candy farm. And he just volunteers gossip about their illegal gambling activities.
Yeah.
Like, he just kind of starts spilling it. So I guess that pretty much confirms their suspicions.
Right.
And they wonder where the aerials might be hiding. And Jesse talks about pirate radio in particular, which I thought was interesting. I mean, it's not really like commercial, or not commercial, but like, it's obviously a very private broadcast, but it's not
Right.
really, because instead of being over the... Because I think at the time there were already some frequencies assigned to amateur transmitters. But I guess Jessie's receiver was capable of picking those up. So she just sort of burst in on it all of a sudden. But it also seems like they might be using an illegal frequency. So, I don't know. Like, they might be actually using a frequency that's supposed to be commercial.
Yeah, I mean, if they're having their gambling business conducted over this frequency, it makes sense to...
Yeah, well, obviously they're doing illegal activity, but I don't know. So, yeah, there's a bit of a false scare where they think the Stanley House caught fire and, like, got struck by lightning because of the antennas, and Jessie feels, like, mortifyingly guilty for about 2 seconds, but then it turns out that they were just soldering and there was some smoke, so not a big deal.
The boys screwed it up.
Yeah. Boys will be boys.
Yeah.
But Mr. Norwood's away and nobody can reach him, and time's running out for Bertha and his clients. They go get Henrietta and thinking they'll go out to the farm again, and they give Henrietta this new silk taffeta dress, and from that moment on, all Henrietta can do is talk about the dress and how beautiful it is. Like, she's useless now.
It's really kind of sad.
It's really demeaning.
Yeah.
Like, I get it. I mean, she should be happy, right? I guess I understand. But, like, when they're in danger or when they're, like, trying to do something, it's just like she suddenly turned into this totally vain creature who does nothing but stare at herself and talk about how beautiful the dress is. And she wants everybody to see it. And it's like, it's really too much. And she doesn't really have any interest in her cousin anymore, it seems, which is kind of sad. And Derry and Bird show up, and Derry has this idea of getting Bertha out that doesn't involve using Henrietta as bait, which is what they were planning to do. It's probably a good thing that they don't want to do that now, because Henrietta suddenly, like, lost all her intelligence points. She's probably had some kind of spell cast on her by a mage, and now she's like, I don't know. I played a lot of D&D this weekend. So, Derry, Bird, and Amy and Jessie and Henrietta and Mark, the rich guy from Stratford Town, who runs...
He's just there for some reason, I guess? Like, he just shows up? I don't know.
I guess, well, he's the friend of the boys, so he's there to help them, I guess. And, I don't know. So, at first they don't see the aerial again, but Mark, I think it is, climbs up on a telegraph pole and sees that there's a folding staff antenna affixed to the tower behind the house.
Yeah.
And indeed, the princess is in the tower. And the theory is that when it's horse racing time, someone hangs around the tower and observes the track with binoculars or something, and then sends a coded radio message to which somebody in the city picks up the frequency and bets accordingly, I guess. And the antenna is just sort of folded down when it's not in use, which is handy. Somebody must have forgotten for a minute and let Bertha broadcast. So they push in, and there's some random old lady there, and she's really not much use against anybody. So they just sort of shove her out of the way and get Bertha. She's like just this grumbling old lady who's hanging around, supposed to guard the tower, I guess.
Yeah.
And they get Bertha out, and they drive to New York, and I think that's where the court is. And Bertha testified, and she might also be related to this programming guy at Stratford Town. So basically, she's gonna be rich, and I guess Henrietta is too.
Yeah.
And all's well, and there's a bit of a promo for a book to come, The Radio Girls on the Program.
Yep, there's 3 more of these things.
Yeah. And the promo is cleverly inserted into the text proper, so it's not like, stay tuned for the next book. And it's like kind of part of the... It's kind of cool, I guess. And they go upstairs to listen to a concert from a French soprano with an unpronounceable name. And that's the end of the Campfire Girls of Roselawn, or A Strange Message from the Air. Yeah. So, I don't know. It was cute, I guess. I enjoyed some of the banter between Jessie and Amy was sort of fun, I guess, in a way.
The 20s slang was pretty silly.
Yeah, it was totally like full of like the weird sort of slang talk of the time and stuff, but also like not really. Like it did seem, obviously kind of aimed at a very young audience. So
Amy says cat's foot twice.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, there's a lot of overwriting going on in the book. Like, there's a lot of, instead of just saying Bertha or Henrietta did this, it's something like Henrietta's cousin with the so-and-so did this. And like, we already know that, right? It's just,
Yep.
it just seems like a lot of stuff made to pad out the
No,
wording.
there's definitely a lot of padding.
So,
Like the whole subplot with Belle just didn't need to be there.
yeah, well, that didn't go anywhere, but
Yeah.
I mean, not only that, but just even like just average conversations have a lot
Right.
of extra, like, we already know that Bertha and Henrietta are cousins. Like, we don't need to be reminded of that all the time.
Yeah.
And when it's just like where somebody's talking, it doesn't need to be like the cousin who had formerly been trapped in the tower.
Yeah.
I guess on some level I sort of liked it. Like, it was fun enough. And
Yeah.
the radio stuff was interesting because I do remember, like, obviously much, much later when radios were very different than how they were in this story. I mean, I never had the privilege of building a crystal set. So that was a hobby for kids for a really long time, for decades afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of enthusiasm for it here. I mean, they go to the library to find out all the equipment that they're going to need, and they put it together themselves. It seems like pretty strenuous work, some of it, stringing up all the wire over several stories, and, how are we going to move this that high up in the air, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. There was definitely a lot of... I can see how... I mean, obviously, I'm not going to say it was, like, progressive, because, I mean, the whole thing is very clearly defined by, it's girls that are going to be reading this book, right? Clearly.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So, even, like, the sense of empowerment that the author seems to want to transmit to her readers, like, is probably in the service of just making them feel good about reading it. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
rather than making a point, like a positive point about what women should be able to do.
And plus, it's another marketing demographic.
Yeah, yeah. And, like, don't forget, too, that when a hot boy comes in, like, the girls really want to, they don't want to be in those overalls. Like,
Right.
let's put it that way. It's
Yeah.
But there are 3 other books, and I don't know where they go. I guess they might get more into the radio stuff. I'm not really planning to go there, but
No, I don't think we are.
it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, we're not for sure, but I'm not personally. I'm
Oh.
not eager to revisit the adventures of Jesse and Amy, but I was okay with spending a couple of days with them, which is, I mean, it took me, I think, 3 settings to read this book, and
Yeah, it goes by very quick.
yeah, like I've been saying on the podcast many times that I'm normally quite a slow reader. But I mean, something like this, or something that I'm really enjoying. Like, I did read a couple of really good books this month besides the stuff that we were doing for the podcast. And
Yeah.
I just raced through them because I was enjoying them that much.
Right,
So it normally
right.
took me, what could take me a week to read from Henry James took me like 2 days to get through from some of these people. But this wasn't, it wasn't quality, but it was fast. And I don't know. I mean, if you really want to read a relic from 100 years ago, talking about radio and how awesome it is, which they're totally right about.
Yeah.
Give it a shot. I don't know. It's kind of neat little book, I guess.
Yeah,
in a
there's
way.
some interesting stuff here for sure.
Yeah, classes, whatever aside, but
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So an interesting thing that is brought up in this book is, although we don't really know exactly how, it's not described very much in the radio Girls of Roselawn, because we just see Jesse tuning around and suddenly running into this broadcast, but there's a concept of broadcast being interrupted or interfered with, which goes back quite a long way.
Yeah.
And there's records of that happening as early as like 1906 or something
Definitely,
like
yeah.
that, where people would be interfering with, quote, important government dispatches and so on. And there was really nothing that they could do to stop them at that time.
No.
Unless you could somehow find where the transmitter was.
Yeah.
It's something that over time we learn to make use of techniques, but at first, in their infancy, there's a lot of strange stuff that can happen and not necessarily an easy way to regulate things. And that's kind of something that I thought about while reading this. So we're also going to talk about one final story that kind of deals with that a little bit
Oh,
in a
definitely,
very
yeah.
strange way.
Yeah.
And this is a story from a first for our podcast, which will be one of the great American, I guess you could say, pulp science fiction writers
Yeah.
of the 1930s and beyond. And we've never covered somebody like this before, but And some people might think that we would gravitate to somebody else, perhaps, but the writer that we've chosen is Theodore Sturgeon, and we are going to talk about his story, Ether Breather, in just a moment. The subject of our current discussion was born in 1918 on Staten Island. His real name was, in fact, Edward Hamilton Waldo, but it was legally changed to Theodore Sturgeon when he was 11 years old, and his mother remarried to a stepfather he apparently always hated. And he worked a lot of jobs in his younger years, but started writing when he was quite young, actually, and had his first sale to McClure's newspaper syndicate when he was 20 years old, just before enlisting in the Merchant Marines. And he was writing a lot of newspaper stories around this time, and it was sort of an interesting mixed bag for him, I guess, because this is a person that wrote a lot of stuff, and he's very prolific, many short stories, and lots of reviews and different things throughout his life, novels. Just a very prolific writer in many different genres, but most known for his science fiction work, essentially. And certainly a few of his stories have been adapted for television and radio. Some of them are quite well known. There's a lot of radio adaptations, including for the X-1 series, but also the new Twilight Zone in the 1980s adapted two of his stories. He wrote 2 screenplays for Star Trek, the original series. They're quite famous stories, actually, especially the story Amok Time, which introduced the Vulcan mating ritual. And, of course, the famous Live Long and Prosper, plus the Vulcan hand salute, and so on.
Right.
That everyone knows and loves today. Sturgeon, is kind of an interesting guy. He got really into the counterculture, I think, in the 60s and even earlier. For a while there, he was a practicing nudist. Was friends with a lot of the, his contemporary writers. Robert Heinlein and he were certainly at least heavy correspondents, although I feel like they were quite different writers and probably ideologically opposed in a lot of ways, but they seemed to get along. And Sturgeon was often somebody who, despite his prolific writing output, suffered from writer's block. So he once wrote about how he lamented this to his friend Heinlein, and Bob, as he said, wrote him back a response, and in his letter he just included a whole bunch of potential plot lines for stories, and he's just like, oh, well, we can write about this, or you can write about this, and I don't know, I mean, I'm not a great Heinlein fan, and I think that, Sturgeon is probably a better writer overall, but it's interesting that they had that kind of writing companionship sort of thing going on sometimes. Yeah. But his early stories were written for McClure's, and he tried to break into other markets, but for a little while there, it was probably quite frustrating for him as he was working at sea and trying to write stories. And the newspaper pieces, all of his stories have been collected recently in this giant volume set of short stories, and you can kind of go chronologically, see the really early ones. It's kind of interesting because he wrote a lot of stuff that seemed to be kind of to spec, and kind of went against maybe a lot of things that he might have been thinking, perhaps, but that, are just patriotic tales, for instance, and weird sea stories with this kind of odd humor to them and stuff like that. It just seemed like he was really trying to sell. But then every so often he would write this really creepy dark horror story or this like really strange fantasy. And this is eventually became his market, and he eventually found himself in working in those kind of genres. So by 1939 and 1940, he was starting to write less of the kind of slightly cheesy, perhaps, newspaper stories, like sort of jingoistic, weird newspaper stories, and more like of the stuff that he wanted to write, which was a little bit stranger and quirkier. Another story that was written the year after this one, I think is kind of interesting. It's a story called It, and it was written in 1940, and it's basically a horror story about this, like, weird, giant, I guess, I don't know what it looks like exactly, like this kind of, almost like a mud pile or something like that, and it's like this sentient, but not really smart creature that sort of goes around absorbing things, and it's like the people who live in this farmhouse having to deal with this, like, monster. And it's like, really, I don't know, it's kind of funny that Stephen King 40 years later would become very known for a book called It that was like 1,000,000 times longer, and that I feel like King probably read that story, and I'm not saying that they're similar, but I'm just saying like the style is a little bit similar, and I feel like, oh, he must have known about it, like, you know, he must have known. I must be one of the few people that, like, when somebody says It, I don't first think of the Stephen King book. I think of that 1940 Theodore Sturgeon story about this, like, giant fucking mud pile that goes around threatening this family and is, like, single-minded, just wants to eat things, right? And it's just, like, the way he writes it is similar to the way somebody like Stephen King would sort of personify these monsters and stuff like that. And
Stephen King was definitely really well read with all the early pulp sci-fi horror stuff. And he talks about how much he loves all that stuff quite a bit in his nonfiction.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of great sci-fi horror early on, and it's really interesting to read. So, in 1938, a year before this story was published, and 2 years before something like It, John W. Campbell wrote the famous story Who Goes There, which of course became The Thing. That's another famous sci-fi horror story, and justifiably so, that lives on in infamy to this day.
Right.
John Campbell, of course, is the person that published this story, Ether Breather, and it was shortly into his editorship of Astounding Magazine. And although I don't believe he was actually the founder of Astounding Magazine, he's certainly he was like probably the second editor or something like that, and he certainly ran it during its most prestigious years. And all the writers that wrote for him said that he was instrumental in essentially coaching a lot of them into being stronger stylists and better writers than what you would expect from some of the periodicals intended for that kind of fiction in that time. And I think it's true, and to a certain extent. I mean, you compare, not that I'm a real expert, because I never used to really pay attention to what magazine stories were published in, because I mostly read them in anthologies, being born in 1980 and all, and not really exposed to the magazines the way they were. But now I started to pay attention to that more, and I kind of realized what the tunes of the different magazines were, like the popular ones anyway. Like you had the Planet Stories, which Sturgeon also published in. Galaxy magazine was more political, almost, a lot more satire and stuff like that. Amazing Stories was like probably one of the more simple writing style-wise and had a lot of fancy gadgetry and cool stuff.
Yeah.
And Astounding was more like aliens and what they might think like, and space travel, and Asimov wrote us a lot of stories for it. Heinlein did, obviously, and Sturgeon, until about 1950 or so, and I guess he and Campbell might have had a falling out of some kind, because he was sometimes difficult to work with, and he had some perhaps unfortunate traits, like being a pretty irritating racist, apparently, and Samuel Delaney definitely has some things to say about that.
Yeah.
But Ether Breather in 1939 was Theodore Sturgeon's first published science fiction story. He sold the story to Campbell's other magazine, Unknown, around the same time, called God in the Garden. But this was pretty much the beginning of a very long and interesting career, and he would just get better and better, I think. I mean, like, some of the early horror stories are really good, but, like, in terms of really thought-provoking, interesting science fiction. This is interesting, but it's also sort of embryonic. Like, you can tell that he's feeling his way a little bit still. And it's really cool, though. Like, it's neat to see where it starts for him. And
Yeah, I'm not really too familiar with his work. I'd only read the one thing that's in the Dark Descent.
which one is that again?
Bright Segment, which is later from 55.
Ah, okay. Bright Segment. Yeah, I haven't actually read that. So, interesting.
That was a good one, though.
That's cool. I gotta read that.
Yeah.
I haven't read that story yet. And horror is definitely something that he visited quite often, actually. Even predating this story, there were a couple, I thought, in his collected short stories, there are a couple of really effective horror stories.
Yeah, that one is definitely horror with no science fiction elements from what I can recall.
Yep, some of them are definitely like that.
Yeah.
Some of them do have a little bit of a science fictional quality. But yeah, that's interesting. Interesting. And in the volume 1 of the 13-volume set of collected Theodore Sturgeon short stories, there are several introductions, and one of them is by Ray Bradbury. He talks very effusively about Sturgeon. And there are two writers that I think that in terms of perhaps having... Because Sturgeon did, in fact, never cease trying to write for mainstream publications, and he did succeed quite often. So there are a few of his stories that are published in more and like non-genre magazines and stuff like that. He had somewhat of an aspiration to being perhaps a more literary writer, and like Bradbury, I think he can kind of be considered in the category of, even though his name might not be necessarily as well known.
Yeah.
He certainly had the ability to step outside a little bit, and perhaps he should have been more well known, I think. But anyway, this story, Ether Breather, is quite a charming little piece.
Yeah, I definitely enjoyed this one.
Yes. We have a writer, Ted Hamilton. Interesting. Now, very clear reference to Sturgeon himself.
Right.
It's finally managing to sell what he thinks is a not great piece of work. Maybe had in mind some of his newspaper pieces right now. And it's gone through many iterations, though, and it's this plotless wonder called The Seashell. And it's now to be a television play using the new polychrome color technique. And the sponsor is a perfume company, Bibliography. And it's during one of their ads that he first notices something really weird. The ad break comments on the play itself. And it's a man and woman talking to each other. And the man thinks, the play stinks! And he commented that the girl he's talking to also stinks because of whatever perfume she's wearing. So Hamilton's really incensed. And he calls Associated Television right quick. And he knows the receptionist. And she complains to him that everyone seems angry right now. And she can't figure out why. And no, Ted can't talk to the script man, Griff, because Griff is being yelled at by Berbelot, the perfume magnate. And everyone wants to sue the pants off everyone else. It's really horrible. And hanging up in a huff, Ted goes back to the TV, and slowly this sense of self-satisfaction steals over him during the last act of the play. But then, during a tender loving scene, the guy buries his head in the girl's hair, and he says, I hate your fucking guts.
That Ben Circus song.
Yeah. He doesn't actually write the four-letter word, but he makes it clear that that's what's meant.
Yeah, he definitely makes it clear that's what he says.
Yeah. And Hamilton is so pissed that he smashes his TV, and he runs over to Associated Television offices. And in the lobby, he meets Berbelot, and they both want the same thing, to kill Griff, the script guy. So when they get to his office and there's some assault, Griff is being beaten within an inch of his life and panting and struggling. And he says, there was nothing amiss during the production. We got a recording if they want to see for yourself. And of course they do. But guess what? The in-house recording is fine. Everything went off the way it was supposed to.
And what's interesting thing about this is, I guess a modern audience might not necessarily take it in this way, but an audience in 39 would, is that video recording technology wasn't commonplace at all at this point.
So, I mean, even up into the 50s,
yeah.
the BBC, for instance, broadcast a lot of their stuff live and didn't make recordings.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And that's why we don't have things like the first Quatermass serial.
Right.
Or the first production of 1984 with Peter Cushing and Andre Morel.
Right.
Because they did actually try to record Quatermass, but apparently the recordings just didn't work out. And during the one or so remaining episode, you can actually see this insect stuck on the camera that just stays there throughout, stuck on the image through the entire.
Yeah, a lot of production mistakes make their way into the Dark Shadows broadcast, which are about a decade later.
That was much later, though.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they were recorded a little bit ahead of time, at least.
They normally shot it on one take, just because they had to shoot every day because it was a daytime soap opera. But yeah, for 39, the technology was kind of feasible, but it wasn't until the 1950s that a videotape recorder was really adopted by the industry.
So I neglected to mention, but this was published in Sturgeon's first short story collection, Without Sorcery, as well, in 1948. And that's where the Ray Bradbury introduction originally comes from, actually. So in that book, though, Sturgeon does what some of his compatriots like Asimov did later on when they published their stories, and kind of wrote a bit about the initial experience of publishing them and put it as a little intro in the book, right? So he said, he was talking about the technology, and he said that, well, it's now 1948, and color television is already a reality. So, in the story, it's not quite made clear, but it seems to have set, maybe almost 200 years after the time of writing.
Yeah, definitely.
So, things have taken a while to develop. But I guess it's better to be safe than sorry, right? If you're going to date your work, I guess.
Yeah.
That's why I'm a fan of writers not doing that. Even, it's just really funny because, I don't think it actually says this anywhere in the actual text of Dune, but in both Dune movies so far, it starts with a thing that says, oh, in the year 10,100 and something, okay, great.
Yeah.
So we know it's far in the future.
Right.
So we don't have to bitch if we don't have flying cars.
Right.
Right. But he talks about the color TV being a reality, and in 1939, there wasn't really much television yet, obviously. He said, he was talking about the scanning disc in 1939, and it's the only video transmission method available.
Right.
And that is mentioned at one point in the actual story. It's just interesting, less than 10 years later, he's already kind of commenting on the authenticity of the story. And Sturgeon involved in technical stuff. His brother was it's a technical writer and stuff like that, and he did some of that stuff freelance as well. I neglected to mention, though, one of the coolest things that he wrote that also became a film was Killdozer. The Killdozer, yeah. It's just so fun to say as well. And it was one of the better, one of those cool 1970s TV movies. Of course, also the name of a band, but...
Yeah, right.
The story is the best. The movie is pretty cool, but the story is great. Another example of, that weird sci-fi horror. And it's really good. So, anyway, that I probably should have said earlier on, but I forgot to mention Killdozer, because I can't leave out Killdozer, though.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we're going to come back to Sturgeon many times in the future when we get to more Golden Agey stuff.
Yeah, I would certainly like to. And Killdozer would be a really fun story to cover, actually. Yeah. So, yeah. But the recording is fine. And so, but Hamilton and Burbelow are not convinced at all. So, Burbelow, it turns out, has made his own recording from his receiver. So, they adjourn to review. And, what do you know? But the Burbelow recording has the insulting language on it. And it turns out that Associated Television had them both legally sign away all their rights, so it seems they can't sue. And they turn on their television, and it seems that Associated's now off the air because they've broken the FCC regulations about profanity. There's a new organization around that time. It's interesting that 200 years hence, he thought the FCC would still be a thing.
Yeah, right.
So,
well,
yeah.
Not wrong so far.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah. So, Associated were supposed to be the first to use the new color technique, but now others have stepped in, and Cineradio puts on the production of the old opera Carmen, and everyone in the audience at the auditorium sees one thing, but the TV audience sees the diva break off in the middle of an aria and start singing modern dance song and stripping off her clothes. And the orchestra is really into it, and the audience is into it. Everyone's dancing in the aisles, and possibly in semi-nude states.
Right.
The TV network is, of course, mortified, and Hamilton goes to see Barbello again. And, well, okay, now we get some news outlet. They're like, well, people keep screwing up this color TV thing. Let's try it. So they do. And they put the Secretary of State on TV, and he starts to make a boring speech. And he suddenly starts making rude jokes. So they start to theorize that somehow the transmissions are being intercepted in the airwaves and modified somehow. Barbello has a television lab. It turns out he's a connoisseur and enthusiast for this sort of thing. And he decides to transmit through his own polychrome apparatus to his country home 800 miles away. The signals will be beamed back to them, and he describes the polychrome broadcast vaguely as a series of out-of-phase electromagnetic vibrations. So, within minutes, they see the images of each other on the television screen, start to talk back to them, and not repeating what they're saying, but telling jokes, and they announce that they're having fun. And they didn't realize they did anything wrong, because they're being harangued and called out. And they're starting to feel like kind of bummed out. So they're like kids. And they like coming through the broadcasts. They exist in the ether, and they don't reflect light or really look like anything. And they seem to really want to talk. And they've been aware of humans for hundreds of years. And they started seeing the first TV broadcasts, but only the polychrome thing allows them to get through somehow. So they say, they're like commenting right away that they thought the seashell thing was really stupid.
Yeah.
But it allowed them to talk for the first time. And the polychrome pattern is in convolution with their brain currents, and that's why they can do it. And Barbello and Hamilton sort of try to interrogate them about themselves, but they say, well, we are one of many, finite and infinite. And they say they want to do something for their audience. And Hamilton, of course, sort of butts in with, well, you can stop messing with our broadcasts. And they're suddenly very bashful and say that they will. And they won't bother people anymore. They're sorry. And they go away. Just like that. And Barbello's really upset. And Hamilton feels really bad. And they can't contact the ether people anymore. And that's the end of the story.
Yeah, this one was a lot of fun, I have to say. And
it was.
The thing that immediately came to mind is the Doctor Who broadcast intrusion incident.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, what exactly did they do? I can't remember exactly what happened.
So it was on a syndicated broadcast on Chicago TV in the 80s of...
The Horror of Fang Rock?
Yeah, Horror of Fang Rock, where some guy in a Max Headroom mask appears saying nonsense. I guess it's technically profanity, but it's just so weird. And then he's like getting slapped in the ass by somebody off screen. It goes on for like 30 seconds maybe, and then just stops. And then Horror of Fang Rock resumes. But
wow.
It's recorded on YouTube, and you can see it.
That is far out.
Yeah.
So it's audio and video?
Yeah.
Wow. That's so interesting. Yeah.
And, like, nobody knows who did it.
And to this day, they don't know.
Yeah.
And there's never been an isolated video of that surfacing that doesn't seem to be patched into the Doctor Who signal. Wow.
Yeah.
That's really something. Yeah. Obviously, thinking about broadcast interruption and interference and stuff, and one thing that I thought of was the Galaxy being episode of The Outer Limits, too.
Yeah, right.
Where it's, I think it's also television, or is it radio? I can't.
I think it's radio. Yeah, it was radio and then television.
Radio and television, okay.
Yeah, this is the very first episode of The Outer Limits.
Right.
I only got like 3 or 4 episodes into the series, so it's definitely one of the few episodes I've seen on that one.
So it was another instance of aliens finding and using our signals.
Right.
And transmitting messages and perhaps using them for other purposes. And in that case of that episode, there was communication also with a kid, I believe. I have to watch the episode again.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've seen it, at least 10 years.
Yeah. So this is like sort of, again, also another trope in science fiction that was Not exactly new. I mean, I guess First Man in the Moon can sort of be considered one of these, but it's sort
Yeah.
of like the first contact gone wrong, kind of.
Right,
In this
right.
case, it's not that, like, tragic, but it's kind of sad, you know? It's just like, maybe if you were just a little nicer, they would have stuck around and you
Yeah,
could have
they,
talked to
they
them.
seemed
And
sincerely offended. They thought they were just having a good time.
yeah. So there is a sequel, though.
Oh, is there? Yeah.
Yes, there's a sequel that was published a year ahead of this one. So I think it brings back the breathers.
Hmm.
Butyl and the Breather, it's called, and it's like, I remember I did read that one, but I didn't reread it for this episode, so it's been a few years and I don't quite remember how it goes, but it
Right.
has Berbello and Hamilton specifically contacting the Breathers again. So he didn't let this one lie, and you can see why. The story was actually quite popular at the time of publication. It was voted the best story of its issue in Astounding at the time. Now, it was somewhat forgotten about later on because of other things Sturgeon wrote, perhaps, and, like, it's not one of his, I guess, most celebrated works, but as his first published science fiction story, I think it still warrants comment, and
Oh,
it's quite
definitely.
interesting on its own, and I think it does fit into the theme of the episode today,
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
in a nice sort of way to cap off everything that we've talked about before by something that I think would be recognized by most people as really falling into the tropes of futuristic science fiction and alien contact and creatures existing in another dimension, which the stuff that we've done today so far has been very
Real world,
grounded,
would
I
say.
suppose,
Yeah.
in the real world events
Yeah.
and things that people know. I mean, with some possible exceptions. Yeah, Campfire Girls, perhaps, but for different reasons.
Right.
But yes, and I really like this writer, so just coming back to something early from him, to think that, like, he would develop quite a bit, but even here, humor and his kind of confident, brash style is pretty much in full force. So, fun read, definitely.
I definitely liked it.
Yeah. And recommended if you are into the early Astounding stuff. And because one thing that I think John Campbell was really interested in showing, and it's kind of an interesting paradox because people like Asimov complained, I guess, that. And Asimov is somebody who had a lot of time for Campbell, unlike some writers who, beyond his firm and I guess almost universally considered good editorship, some people didn't really speak very kindly of him, and perhaps with good reason. Asimov is somebody who had quite a bit of time for him, and although they had their disagreements, they also spent a bit of time together and lunch together, and I think Asimov thought of him as a friend at least some of the time. But he said, like, even he complained that Campbell would be a little bit, he would be like, well, I want you to show me aliens and show them as being very alien and having their own thought processes. And Asimov's like, yeah, that's great, I'll do that. But he also didn't want them to be shown as being, like, superior to humanity in any way.
Right.
Like, he wanted them to be sort of, I mean, if you look at even the Who Goes There story, right? Like, I think most of us have seen at least the John Carpenter film adaptation, if not both film adaptations.
Mm-hmm.
Or what I find really interesting is that the Campbell story is quite similar to the Carpenter adaptation, more so than the Thing from Another World film. But that's not true of the ending. The ending of the Campbell story is very optimistic and is very, like, human individuality and strength will, in fact, triumph over this.
Yeah, that's definitely not the case with the movie, yeah.
No, and it's not. The movie is much bleaker, but like, the original Thing from Another World movie, even though it resembles Campbell's story less, the ending definitely feels more like it comes from a little bit of that mindset, right? Where I guess the ending of the first film is not that optimistic, but it's kind of like, we conquered the enemy for now, but watch the skies because they'll still be coming, right? And it's
right.
Kind of, I don't know. I mean, it's always been an interesting thing to me, but Campbell, very interesting figure. I think that in a future episode, we will certainly be talking a little bit more about the magazines and specifically Astounding.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's a lot to go into for this episode because we've had so much radio background and stuff, but it's been good to introduce one of those writers, and I think in another episode when we're not so much talking about a scientific theme or development of its time, we'll talk a little bit more about those early magazines and their editors and what perhaps they might have believed in and what kind of stories they wanted to publish and how they brought up various writers and Campbell was definitely one of the forerunners of that. So
Yeah.
we'll be talking about that a lot more in the future. So I think that pretty much wraps up tonight's episode of Chrononauts. What's coming next?
So next time, we are going to be looking at the strange genre of the Edisonade. Back in our episode on Automata, we covered the Steam Man of the Prairies, which was sort of an early precursor to this whole thing of a boy inventor who invents this, I don't know, Steam Man vehicle, what have you, and has adventures with it. And this was a really big thing in the 1890s, early 1900s dime novel circuit. And it is definitely intended for a more juvenile audience, but I think is a foundation of the publishing industry as targeting a younger audience for genre works. You had a lot of the dime novel stuff in the 1860s and 70s with like Western themes and things like that. But by the time we're getting to the 1890s, it's really more of these pulp adventures with weird, unique gadgets, which carry out a lot further forward.
Lots of gadgets.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So next time, we're going to be reading 4 of these works. We're going to be reading Frank Reed Jr. and his new Steam Man, or The Young Inventor's Trip to the Far West, from 1892 by a Louis Senaris, or I don't even know if that's a real name. It was originally credited under no name. We're also going to be reading Tom Edison Jr.'s Electric Sea Spider by Philip Reed from 1892. Electric Bob's Big Black Ostrich by Robert Toombs, that's Toombs with 2 O's, from 1893. And Edison's Conquest of Mars by Garrett P. Service, which does break from the mold a little bit in that it's not a boy inventor type thing, but rather Thomas Edison himself, who attacks the Martians in an unauthorized sequel of War of the Worlds, which we'll be getting to further down the line, but...
Yeah, we're doing things in the opposite. We do things opposite here, the way you would expect. We don't do that. We do the opposite. We cover the weird, unauthorized sequel novel before the famous classic. So we've already done a number of H.G. Wells books, though, and we're not leaving him alone.
Nope, we're going to come to that book eventually.
Very soon, yeah. I'm thinking we're covering all the major Wells science fiction adjacent novels and some of the short stories. So, but that's for a later time. Now you can enjoy us doing our weird Edisonades next month. Feel free to read them. They sound pretty strange.
Yeah.
And not very long.
Nope, they're all relatively short, and they should go by pretty quickly, much in a similar fashion that the Radio Girls did this time, I would imagine anyway.
Yes. So, with all that in mind, remember to practice your dots and dashes, and make sure that your lightning switch is engaged. This is Chrononauts, signing off.